in progress. I think thinking about it in maybe local settings is more useful than thinking about it in abstract terms and in like really high levels of abstraction. I think in New York, our contract faculty union is part of UAW, and through UAW I started meeting, for example, workers in submarine manufacturing, which I've never ever crossed paths before. And I think finding these outlets where we can actually meet with people and talk to them about their issues, because we don't know their issues much either, and we don't really show up for their issues as much either. And I don't think it's fair to expect them to show up for us unless we are there showing up for other people. So I think we need to start with asking people, hey, what are your issues? And, oh, these are our issues, and there's some overlap here between even though these issues might look different, academic freedom might not sound like something that's related to your life, but let's talk about it, and maybe we can see how these things coalesce and overlap at some point. So I think thinking about that local level is really important, and I'm thinking about it in terms of like cross-institutionally. We have been building a cross-institutional network with universities and colleges across the larger New York metro area. And there are complex, smaller schools there that are much better integrated into the communities where they are compared to some of the private Ivy League schools that are much more shut off. And I think they have a different relationship with their communities that we can learn from and maybe try to then model and emulate, and bringing in parents and talking to higher K-12 teachers, right? I mean, they have a different kind of relationship with their communities. So I think thinking about it at the kind of grassroots level, the neighborhood level, the local level, is a better place to start than thinking about it in abstract terms, which is much harder to do, I think. And in New York, I think, again, I am in New York, so I know New York better, and maybe this is not applicable to other places, but there's such a density of higher ed institutions, and also we might have a relatively granular local government. So we have a really unique opportunity to build some kind of models of solidarity and networks and coalitions that can then maybe amended, but could also, be replicated elsewhere in other contexts.
Ken, I'm wondering if I could follow up on kind of lessons learned in the current conjuncture for the global human rights movement. It would seem to me, and excuse me if in advance if I seem to be continued contrarian in my questioning, but if we think about the rise of the global human rights movement, it occurred at a time when hegemonic powers at least were rhetorically committed to an idea of a liberal international order, and that period no longer really exists in the same way. And the global human rights movement relied on kind of a strategy of kind of naming and shaming, and that was a very effective kind of strategy. And I'm wondering if that strategy is still, from your perspective, is that still the dominant approach, or do there need to be different kinds of strategies and tactics for the human rights movement at this time?
Well, this is what my book's about. Righting wrongs, if you want to look at it. But first, I think it's worth noting that the shaming was always one of basically two key tools of the human rights movement. The other was going to allied governments and getting them to impose diplomatic and economic costs on an abusive government. And so the idea is, one, you harm the government's reputation because everybody pretends to respect human rights and everything today. Second, every two-bit desperate still wants something from the international community, whether it's arms sales or preferential trade benefits or an invitation to some fancy summit. Whatever it is, you can deprive them of that if they don't behave back. And those are the aims of the human rights movement. Those tools are still very much in place. Now, with shaming, there obviously are certain issues that are harder. If you go to Viktor Orban and say, you're mistreating migrants, he'll say, of course I am. That's my life. But mistreatment of migrants was less popular in Brussels. And so we were able to go to the European Union and get it to condition these huge subsidies given to Hungary on what's known as better respect for the rule of law. That's, EU's for, better rights standards. With somebody like Trump, if you go to him and say you're violating human rights, it's kind of scary to say, what are those? But Trump is very shameful. And I think some of the big movements that we've seen with respect to Gaza and Ukraine are a product of shaming Trump. Because what does he care about? He sees himself as this master negotiator. His book was The Art of the Deal. This guy can, close a deal any place. And when it looked as if he was being bamboozled by the likes of Netanyahu in Gaza or Putin in Ukraine, ultimately he was getting enough press about that he was shamed. And so, why did he shift on Gaza? It's partly that Netanyahu had so much chutzpah that he tried to attack the Hamas negotiators in Qatar, and that was a step too far for the Gulf Arab leaders. And these are people that Trump listens to because they're rich and autocratic, they're his kind of guys. But part of it is that because of the intense media attention to Israel's genocide in Gaza, that even MAGA Republicans were having disquiet about all of this. There are polls showing that young Christian evangelicals, the heart of Trump's base, were Trump. And so, with Trump, it's all about Trump. Whatever's in his self-interest is what guides him. But you could say really it was shaming that helped nudge him to finally put the screws on Netanyahu and say, you are going to agree to this ceasefire, even though you're not getting your maximalist position. You're not getting the mass ethnic cleansing in Gaza. You're not solving the Israeli-Palestinian problem by getting rid of the Palestinians. You're not even getting rid of Hamas entirely. So that, I think was quite successful. It's still a work in progress. But I actually think Trump so loved the accolades of having gotten this deal that he's going to enforce it. Now, I really don't think there's going to be an open return to China. There may be brief conflicts, but I think Trump now has this interest in keeping this going. And then the big question is, because he wants a stabilization force in Gaza, because he wants somebody to rebuild Gaza, the likely suppliers of those troops and arms are insisting on a Palestinian state. And will this push Trump to push that far? He's uniquely able to do this because if a Democrat did this, he'd be pilloried on the right. But Trump owns the right, so he can do whatever he wants. Nobody's going to attack Trump. On Ukraine, similarly, he came in, Putin was his best friend. Putin could do no wrong. He was basically reading Kremlin talking points. And because he was so ridiculed for, after every meeting with Putin, emerging with whatever the Kremlin line was, then he finally realized he had to do something. And now, for the first time in his presidency, he's imposed sanctions on the two leading products, which is a serious matter. He may send Tomahawk cruise missiles to Ukraine. So, these show that shaming, if properly focused, still can make a difference. I think the question, for the purpose of the conference here is, what kind of shaming would be useful with respect to defending academic freedom? And, I do think that, one, universities do have to do a better job of selling themselves. I think this critique of insufficient ideological diversity is probably a fair critique. The answer to that is not government censorship. The answer to that is better self-policing. But that's probably a fair point. But the universities right now are not really explaining, what is a lack of NIH grants mean? Well, it means that the next round of medical advances that could prevent cancer, or what have you, are not being taken for lack of funding. How are we in this great kind of economic fight for technological advancement when suddenly the U.S. funding that has underwritten a lot of the basic science and basic technological investigative work is no longer there? So I think there are ways that make it not about just elite universities. Nobody's going to go to that route, but that make it more about what's in our self-interest. And Trump, who is good at talking about our interests, but bad at actually enforcing it rather than pursuing his own or his cronies, showing that he is actually undermining things that universities deliver of value to society, to all of us. I think that's going to be a big part of the step forward.
That's great. Peter, I'm wondering if you could talk about, since we're talking about building alliances and coalitions, kind of how you see the role, particularly of the diaspora community, of ties with respect to the struggle for democracy back home.
I actually want to branch out to international scrutiny.
Excellent.
International scrutiny in terms of what you have been talking about, trying to connect the dots and build the momentum. I think first thing on academic and democratic backsliding. So I spent a lot of time grooming mixed-gen leaders because I got banned for 10 years by the military. So I spent a lot of time at the Harvard Kennedy School. It's more practical, obviously. Teaching them how to run for public office without compromising their bank account or values. And I believe that if you have fresh blood into a system, even the structure is poor, but if you have new politicians going in all the time, whether it's Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines, Thailand, a lot from Singapore as well, they come to me with their campaign craft plans. Like when they graduate, they want to return home and run political office. The question that I get asked the most was, how much does it cost to start a political party? And guess which country of these students asked me the most? Philippines and Indonesia. The campaign craft, like India and things, they were like, how much does it cost to start a political party? Because none of them align with my values in Philippines and Indonesia. So I think that's one role that I'm trying to do, even if they ban me from running for public office. Or being a player myself, but I can be a coach and groom next-gen leaders for ASEAN when I have the time. The second point about international scrutiny, I'm going to tell you pretty concisely of what can be done to help a competitive autocracy without interfering domestic politics. First thing is call in. Second thing is call out. Third thing is condition. Fourth thing is court, and I'm going to tell you what I mean by that. Calling is because within Asia, you don't want to condemn or you don't want to shame. You might go behind closed doors and you talk about, this is not going to be good for you because of this and that. That's like the minimum that democracies and human rights as a universal value without borders can do for one another, which a lot of Europeans and Australians and Americans were trying to help us during the time. They were trying to talk with someone that I couldn't talk with, friends of Thailand kind of thing. Call out is like condemnation. So that's the second thing that if it goes to a certain extent that is out of bound or disproportionate, that countries can call out that this is not acceptable. Election in Myanmar on December 28th, under such a martial condition is unacceptable, and I hope they say that in the ASEAN summit that is coming up, for example. Condition, this is getting a little bit stickier. Free trade agreements between Europe and ASEAN, free trade agreement between Europe and Asia. Human rights as part of that free trade agreement is going to be quite effective. Harder to do, but going to be quite effective. And the last thing was one of the things that I wanted to do if I became the Prime Minister at the time, is Magnitsky Act. Global Magnitsky Act alignment. I think that will help the entire ASEAN. That will help the scam operation.
Maybe you could explain for people who don't know exactly.
It's named after the Russian lawyer who's trying to expose corruption. So in many countries except for America and Europe and Australia, Japan and South Korea, you can only do sanctions, targeted sanctions on, you cannot do it on human rights abuse. You cannot do it on corruption. But because of the existence of Magnitsky Act, countries can finally, seize assets and do targeted sanctions of the human rights violator. And I wanted to do it for Thailand also because in order for Thailand to help Myanmar, without this we cannot do. There's no legal basis for me to stop money from going from Thailand to junta, whether it's oil, whether it's gem or not. So that was one thing that I felt like if ASEAN has a global, a regional Magnitsky alignment with the same database with the rest of the world. I feel like this is human rights with teeth, finally. It's not just statements, finally. It's finally something that we can do, and we saw that happening in Cambodia from the US, from the UK, and South Korea on the same time. So finally, human rights and human trafficking that comes with scams. Finally, you could stop it with some practical results. Those are the things that I feel like that's a a basis of international scrutiny from call in, call out, condition in your engagement, and then court, which is the Magnitsky Act. Thank you.
Great. So maybe we could open up the conversation to some questions from the audience, and I'll reserve my authoritarian moderator prerogative to throw in my own questions, whatever. And I think we'll try to do the same as before. We'll take 2 or 3 questions. And so I see Ashu, is there a third person?
Over here.
Yep, all the way in the back. Yep.
So, my question is about,
Ashu,
all the way in the back.
microphone, sorry.
My question is about whether a tradition of military interference in politics creates special challenges for crafting effective strategies to reverse democratic backsliding, as compared to situations where military interference in domestic politics is rare or does not exist. Now, of course, it's being tried here now, we know, but there is no tradition of that. Whereas Thailand and Turkey, according to political science, have had a tradition of a lot of military interference. So, we don't know where Trump's plan to involve the military in domestic politics, how far will it go, we don't know, but let's put that aside for a moment, there's no tradition there. Both in Thailand and Turkey, does it create very special obstacles to reversing this backsliding?
All the way in the back.
Hi, so earlier on, we all talked about kind of the importance of voting in terms of democracy and trying to prevent authoritarianism. And so I'm very much of the opinion that increased turnout and accessibility for people across socioeconomic backgrounds is super important for the outcome of democracy. But how might you all respond to someone who's on the other side of that, who only believes that democratic participation should be accessible to people of higher socioeconomic backgrounds or education backgrounds?
And is there one more? Yeah.
Hi, my name is Nas. I'm a student here at NYU program. I want to ask a question to Pita directly. It's a bit personal question for me. Looking back at your political and campaign journey, especially in terms of political campaign strategy, is there anything that you wish you changed back then? And also, I have a second question. As an Indonesian who's also basically fighting the democratic backsliding in Indonesia, right? Is there anything that you'd like to share to us? Any lesson learned from Thailand that we can also use in Indonesia? Thank you.
Maybe we can start with the military intervention question first and then move on to the other.
The short answer is yes, it becomes very tricky. After 13 military coups in 100 years, then the normalization of coups becomes something that's always on the table. The military is smarter. So from generals, they move to judges. So from warfare becomes lawfare. Violence on the street becomes violence in the courtroom. So it's becoming a lot more discreet, and that's why I'm here instead of the government house. It's becoming, autocrats are becoming more discreet. However, during the election campaign, all the military dense, heavy districts, we won landslide. So it's about winning election and domination of ideas with all these army, that your job is to prevent the country from external threat, but never mingle with internal affairs of the country. And I kept repeating that and campaigning inside the army camps and things like that, and it jived with them. So we won landslide in the military dense district. Hard on a macro level, but on the micro level, we have hope of dominating ideas of military. The role is to prevent external threats, but never mingle with the internal affairs of the country.
I would add to this that if you look around at the military-dominated governments that have actually democratized, external pressure is often a key factor. I mean, that was certainly the case with Turkey. I mean, there was a long tradition of military coups against every moderate Islamist government. And the key was actually the possibility of European Union sanctions, which pushed Erdogan to the point when he was still an ally with Gulen to basically use the courts to subordinate the military successfully. Not the Farish trials, but they would have these mass trials that basically ended the military trials. If you look at Brazil, Argentina, Chile, when they all had military juntas, there was very significant international pressure, tacked on to the domestic pressure for democracy that ended up, largely getting rid of that military. These are not real, ongoing problems today. On the contrary, look at a place like Pakistan, where, most recently Imran Khan was just dumped by the international community because it was seen as too anti-Western. And so, the West was quite happy having a military government. It was just more reliable as an ally. So I think that suggests that it's always going to be foremost domestic desire for democracy, but I think that that's pretty pervasive. But then the role of the stance of the international community makes a big difference, and we shouldn't neglect that. I think one of the problems Thailand faces is that the international community is kind of ambivalent about the military rule. They're not so unhappy with it, which is why the military keeps getting away with it.
Yeah, I think maybe the Turkish case is interesting, and I don't know, there might be maybe lessons to think about there that could be useful for other places. I guess the subduing of the military in a way, and the exerting more civilian control over the military did not really go hand in hand with democratization. I think it has impact that I think assumption that civilian control over military is a step toward democratization in the Turkish case did not really quite play out that way, and backsliding happened at the same time as the military was kind of like tamed and subdued through legal and court routes, and I think maybe that's something to think about, like that. That doesn't necessarily; those two things might not necessarily go hand in hand. And in fact, I think the 2016 coup attempt was quite unexpected and unforeseen for many, and it was really a kind of infighting between Erdogan and AKP and the Iran movement. But aside from that, that created even further pretext for purging the military and appointing loyal officers to all ranks of the military. So the military has been brought down under the control of the government, but also that, I think, accelerated the backsliding in some ways, or contributed to the backsliding rather than the other way around.
And then I think the second question had to do with democratic participation, expanding turnout, and encouraging mobilization, etc.
I'll just take a stab at that. First of all, I don't know anybody who really believes in democracy who thinks you should exclude, people who are not elite. That's not a serious position. I think the more, debatable proposition, people who are advocates of turnout as the panacea are often the same people who are just saying, well, let's just double down on our message. Let's appeal to the choir, and that'll be enough. We just get more turnout. And while I think turnout is great, it's a general proposition that we should be promoting it, I don't think it is the panacea. I think that, in this country, there are not enough progressives, even if everybody turns out, to turn back the Trump tide. You have to appeal to the movable middle. And so, I think that's what's interesting about Mandani. Yes, he's turning people out, but he's putting forth a message, affordability, that is a very middle-class, bread-and-butter, ordinary citizen message. He's trying to broaden the base of the Democratic Party. And so I think we have to keep that in mind. It's not enough just to stick with what we've always done and mobilize. We've got to find new ways to speak to a broader constituency, which frankly the Democratic Party's done a poor job of doing. It has emerged now as the party of the elite. It's lost the working class. And its existing leadership is not coming up with, meaningful rhetoric that appeals to a broader constituency. So I think that's what we have to look to, not just now.
So in a developing country, it's about the cost and benefit analysis of going to the polls, because you work on a daily basis in order to make ends meet. And if you have to travel so far up the mountain and you have to queue for such a long time under the rain, people will not just decide that it's not worth it. Especially if you use that to compare to the benefit of choosing, a politician after a politician that doesn't make any difference. So I feel like that's something that in Thailand and many developing countries that you really have to think about this cost and benefit analysis for the voter. Say that if your vote matters, if you go out and vote and you have a candidate that can make a difference, then no matter what, they will travel back from New York to Bangkok. They will travel from Berlin back to Bangkok, or from Tokyo to Bangkok and vote. But if there's no benefit of going to vote and the cost of going is too high, which is by design. The autocrats are trying to make it as far as possible. They're trying to make it on Wednesdays so that you cannot skip work. Those things are piling up. So those are the things that I would worry about. That would be my line of thinking when it comes to participation.
I agree with Ken's comment that I think if somebody is making a statement like that, I think they don't understand what democracy is about. I think it's also important when thinking about turnout to remember that franchise is won out of struggles, right? People fought to expand the franchise. They fought to be able to vote. And then if they're not voting now, I think we need to ask ourselves, not what went wrong, right? What's going on here? That people, put their lives at risk to gain the vote, and then they don't show up to vote, and there is now this voter apathy. And I think there was a discussion in the first panel about electoral democracy and liberal democracy. And electoral democracy does not make democracy, right? Or it is not I don't think it is a substantive way of thinking about what democracy is. And I think, as the panelists both indicated, it's the message that resonates with people and brings them to the voting booth. It's not the other way of it. Just by voting doesn't make democracy work. I think it's the other way around. The substance is what makes democracy work.
And Pete, I think there was a question specifically for you.
I think it's the other way around. We should be looking at Indonesia for your resilience. Dark Indonesia, and finally some specific reform stopped. So you show resilience in the way you do it. Not just within the past 2 months, but looking back to 1997 when reform actually happened, and when everything is still militarized back in the days. Your Senate is actually appointed by the military as well, and then SPY came along, a general himself, started to demilitarize politics in Indonesia. So whether it's long-term or short-term, it's more like we have to learn from you.
And I think there was a direct question about your reflections on your time as campaigning.
No regrets. Very happy with what I had.
Another question. Yeah, David, all the way to the back.
Hi, I'm a PhD student at Georgia Tech, and I have like a follow-up question to you all when we talk about, especially the trial when we talk about military power. Sorry. So you talk about like the importance of achieving like a landslide victory in elections as a way to kind of limit military influence. But like however, like countries like Indonesia, where the military was deeply embedded in business, including exports, or Thailand, where even like election trees have implemented military intervention. How do you see civilian government effectively balancing or reducing the military power impact? I feel like there are like a lot more like different examples from like ASEAN countries that I just want to know more about how you all think about it.
Okay. And David, I think David.
Thanks. So just to stay on the topic of elections for a minute, in the morning session,